I guess this story starts when I found the stray puppy. My grandma, bless her heart, had always loved dogs. She used to tell me stories about the ones she had when she was younger, back on the farm. So, when I found that little furball wandering around the alley behind my apartment, I knew it was meant to be. He was just sitting there, shivering in the cold. I couldn't leave him out there, so I took him in. He was the cutest little thing, with big brown eyes and floppy ears. I didn't have the heart to name him though, thinking that maybe he belonged to someone, and they'd come looking for him. No one ever did. I brought him over to my grandma's place the next day, and her face lit up like a Christmas tree. She was old, and her health wasn't great, but that dog seemed to bring some life back into her. She named him Max, after the dog she had when she was a kid. They were inseparable after that. Max was always by her side, following her around the house, sleeping at her feet. I'd never seen her so happy. Everything was fine for about a year. Then one day, Max just disappeared. We searched everywhere, put up flyers, but he was gone. My grandma was heartbroken. She'd sit by the window every day, hoping he'd come back. But as the weeks turned into months, we had to accept that he was gone for good. It was like losing a part of her, and I could see her getting weaker and weaker after that. I didn't think about Max much after that. I was busy with work, and life just kept moving. But then, about a year later, out of nowhere, Max came back. I remember the day clearly. It was a Saturday morning, and I was over at Grandma's place, helping her with some groceries when we heard scratching at the door. I opened it, and there he was, looking just like he did the day he left. My grandma was over the moon. She hugged him so tight, crying and laughing at the same time. But there was something off about him. He looked the same, sure, but he didn't act like the Max I remembered. He didn't wag his tail or jump around excitedly like he used to. He just stood there, staring at me with those same big brown eyes, but they didn't seem as warm as before. I tried to shake it off, thinking he'd just been through a lot, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Over the next few days, things started to get strange. Max would disappear at night, and we'd find him wandering back home in the early morning, covered in dirt and sometimes with blood on his fur. I'd ask him what he was up to, but of course, he couldn't answer. My grandma didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. She was just happy to have him back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the same dog we lost. Then, killings started. It was a couple of streets over, an old lady who lived alone. She was found dead in her home, mauled to death. The police said it looked like an animal attack. They couldn't figure out what kind of animal could have done something like that in the middle of New York. I didn't think much of it at first. Then it happened again, and again. Each time, the victim was found torn apart, and no one could explain how it happened. I started to suspect Max, but it was too crazy to even say out loud. I mean, how could our sweet little dog be responsible for something like that? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. He'd been acting so strange, disappearing at night and coming back with blood on him. It all added up. One night, I decided to follow him. I waited until Grandma went to bed, and then I sat by the window, watching him. Sure enough, around midnight, he got up and headed for the door. I slipped on my shoes and followed him, keeping my distance so he wouldn't notice me. He led me to an old abandoned building a few blocks away. It was one of those places you just knew to avoid, even during the day. Max slipped through a hole in the fence, and I followed him inside. The place was dark and smelled like mold, but I could hear something moving around in there. I crept through the halls, trying not to make a sound, until I reached a room at the end of the hallway. That's when I saw it. Max was standing over something on the floor, tearing into it with a viciousness I'd never seen before. It was one of the neighbors, a man who lived down the street. Max didn't even look up when I walked in. He just kept going, ripping into him like he was some kind of wild animal. I froze, not knowing what to do. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. Then Max turned around and looked at me. His eyes weren't brown anymore. They were red, glowing in the darkness. That's when I knew this wasn't Max. This was something else. Something evil. I ran out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I got back to my grandma's house. I slammed the door shut, locking every bolt and latch I could find. My heart was pounding, and I could barely catch my breath. I didn't know what to do. How do you explain to someone that their beloved pet is a killer? That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat there in the living room, staring at the door, waiting for Max to come back. I heard him scratching at the door around 3 a.m., but I didn't let him in. I just sat there, listening to him scratch and whine, begging to be let in. But I knew better. The next morning, I tried to talk to Grandma about it, but she wouldn't listen. She said I was being ridiculous, that Max would never hurt anyone. She was in denial, and I couldn't blame her. She loved that dog more than anything, but I knew the truth. I knew what I saw. Couldn't leave her alone with him, not after what I'd seen. So I stayed with her, keeping an eye on Max. He was smart. He knew I was watching him, and he didn't make a move. He just sat there, staring at me with those red eyes, waiting for me to let my guard down. It was a few nights later when everything went to hell. Grandma was in the kitchen, making dinner, and I was in the living room, pretending to watch TV while keeping an eye on Max. Then I heard a crash from the kitchen. I jumped up and ran in, and there was Max, standing over Grandma's body, blood dripping from his mouth. I screamed and grabbed a knife from the counter. Max just looked at me, his eyes glowing brighter than ever. I knew I couldn't take him on my own, so I ran to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. I could hear him scratching at the door, growling, trying to get in. I didn't know what to do. I just sat there, holding the knife, praying for someone to come and save me. But no one came. I was on my own, and I knew, deep down, that I might not make it through the night. I don't know how long I stayed in that room, knife clutched in my hands, waiting for Max to break through the door. The scratching eventually stopped, but I didn't dare move. I knew he was still out there, waiting for me to come out. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, I finally worked up the nerve to open the door. The house was eerily quiet. Kitchen was a mess, blood everywhere, cabinets torn open, but Max was nowhere to be seen, and neither was my grandma. I wish I could say I was brave, that I went looking for her, but I didn't. I grabbed my car keys and ran out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was halfway across the city. I ended up in a cheap motel, the kind of place you go when you don't want to be found. I stayed there for days, too scared to go back home, too scared to even call the cops. What was I supposed to say? That my grandma's dog turned into a demon and killed her? But I couldn't stay there forever. I had to go back. I had to know what happened. So, after nearly a week, I went back to the house. The place was quiet, just like I left it. No sign of Max, no sign of my grandma. It was like they just vanished. I called the police finally. Told them my grandma was missing, that she might have been hurt. They came, searched the place, but they didn't find anything. No body, no blood, nothing. It was like the whole thing never happened. They asked me a lot of questions, but what could I say? I stuck to the basics. My grandma was gone, and I didn't know where she was. Days turned into weeks, and still no sign of her. The police said they were doing all they could, but I knew they'd written her off as just another old lady who wandered off. But I knew the truth. Max had taken her, done something to her, and now he was out there, somewhere, waiting. I started sleeping with a gun. I wasn't taking any chances. I couldn't stop thinking about Max. No, whatever that thing was, I knew he'd be back. It was just a matter of time. The days dragged on, and I started to lose it. Every noise, every shadow made me jump. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. All I could think about was the way Max's eyes glowed in the dark, the way he looked at me like he knew what I was thinking. I was sure he'd come back for me, just like he did with Grandma. Then, one night, I heard it again. The scratching started softly, just a gentle scrape against the front door. But it didn't take long for it to get louder, more desperate, like whatever was on the other side was determined to get in. My heart started racing. I knew it was him. I grabbed the pistol from under my pillow and crept out of the bedroom, trying to keep my breathing steady. The scratching was relentless now, accompanied by a low growl that sent chills down my spine. I reached the front door and pressed my back against it, trying to steady my hands. "Go away," I shouted, but the scratching only got louder. I could hear the wood splintering under his claws, the door rattling on its hinges. He was trying to break it down. I knew I couldn't let him in. Whatever was out there wasn't Max anymore. It was something else, something evil. And if I let it inside, I'd be as good as dead. I braced myself, my hand tightening around the gun. The growling turned into snarling, and I could feel the door shaking behind me, like it was going to give way any second. I didn't have much time. "Please, just go away," I whispered, but I knew it was useless. Max, no, that thing wasn't gonna leave until it got what it wanted. I had to make a decision. I took a deep breath, aimed the gun at the door, and fired. The sound was deafening, the recoil almost knocking me off my feet. The scratching stopped for a moment, and for a brief second, I thought maybe I'd scared it off. But then I heard it again, a low, guttural growl, this time right at the doorframe. I fired again, and again, emptying the clip until all I heard was the click of the trigger. My ears were ringing, and the house was filled with smoke. The scratching had stopped. I stood there, panting, waiting for whatever was on the other side to make its move. There was only silence. I waited, the seconds stretching into minutes, but nothing happened. Slowly, I lowered the gun, my hands shaking. I didn't know if I'd hit it, if I'd scared it away, or if it was just waiting for me to let my guard down. But one thing was clear. The scratching had stopped, and I was still alive. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there on the floor, the gun in my lap, staring at the door. Waiting. But Max, or whatever that thing was, never came back. When the sun finally came up, I slowly got to my feet and approached the door. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I had to know. I had to see if it was over. I unlatched the door and opened it just a crack, enough to peek outside. There was nothing there. No blood, no body, not even a scratch on the door. It was like the whole thing had been a nightmare. But I knew better. I knew that thing was still out there, waiting for the right moment. I don't know what happened to Max or my grandma, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that something came back in his place. Something evil, and it's still out there. Waiting, watching. So if you ever find a stray dog, especially one that's been missing for a while, be careful. Make sure it's really your dog before you let it in. And if you hear scratching at your door in the middle of the night, whatever you do, don't open it. You might not be as lucky as I was. I haven't seen Max since that night, but I know he's out there, somewhere. And I'm always ready, gun loaded, just in case he comes back. 'Cause next time, I might not be so lucky.